Hey, Greg here, founder of Wrestling Divaz.web.com, dedicated to highlighting the most beautiful and deadly entertainers in professional wrestling. My next special guest is an MMA superstar and a member of the legendary Four Horsewomen alongside the likes of Ronda Rousey. A contestant on The Ultimate Fighter Season 18, she is now looking to dominate the world of professional wrestling just as she has the world of MMA. It is my honor to introduce my next special guest, Shayna Baszler. Hi, Shayna. Thanks for joining me. How are you today?
Doing all right. I'm getting ready to hit up some strength and conditioning here. But other than that, it's business as usual.
Well, I'm truly honored that you're joining me, and we have a lot to get to. So I'm interested in hearing about your transition to be a professional wrestler because you've stated that wrestling is essentially the planned performance version of MMA, and certainly a lot of fans would agree with that overlap. But very few in the world of mixed martial arts make the transition successfully. So what was your inspiration to do that move for your career?
Well, I even in my mixed martial arts training, I come from a catch wrestling background. And catch wrestling is basically, for people that are in MMA, it's basically Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu plus pins. So it's pro wrestling, right? You win via pin or submission. And the lineage that I come from with Josh Barnett and training under Billy Robinson, with Gotch and Billy Riley's Snake Pit, this lineage, I come from those guys are from a time where they were shooters and workers. So they could do it for real and they could do the scripted stuff too. And I'm just carrying on the lineage of my martial training, basically. There's no difference, according to down that path, between a shoot fight, MMA, or a worked fight, which is pro wrestling now. So it's a really simple transition for me, I think, specifically because, well, A, I've been a pro wrestling fan my whole life, and B, keeping it true to what my training has been throughout even mixed martial arts.
So in wrestling, you work with the other person to create something that looks a little magical. Every kind of move that you do almost always has to depend on you and your opponent working together, whoever that may be. Despite wrestling being planned, it is still very physical, and it does hurt a lot. I've heard a lot of wrestling competitors that were MMA said they got injured more in wrestling than they did in MMA. Of course, it does depend on your situation. But how is the training for you heading into pro wrestling, and did it at all change your perception of what they go through on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think the main thing as far as the training is that it really isn't all that different for me. I still train mixed martial arts on the pro fight team at CSW. I still do more or less the same strength and conditioning. I train a little bit. It's a little bit different in that in pro wrestling, there's no weight classes. So I don't need to make a certain weight. So a lot of my training for MMA is simply to lose weight and to burn weight off for the sake of being a certain number on the scale. Whereas in pro wrestling, all that sort of happens naturally and it's not as big a concern. The other thing being endurance-wise, a match in pro wrestling could last, 30, 40 minutes. At most in MMA, you're talking 3 5-minute rounds. If you're in a title fight, it's 5 5s, but you get that 1-minute break. And it's just a very different type of conditioning. And just training for the unknown, a lot of times, like I don't know who I'm working at Shimmer. Could be anyone. So, just training specifically for me and my skill set. And then, you're talking about the differences in like the differences on your body. It's very impactful. Something simple that you see all the time, someone teasing a spot on the top turnbuckle, getting pushed off and bumping. That seems so common. Like, we see it every single night, multiple times when we go to a wrestling show. But you don't realize how falling from that height onto a hard surface is adds up on your body. And so when you take these sorts of things, and now you're getting, in the good matches, you're getting hit. You're getting kicked. Watch the match I had with Mia Yim. We're beating the snot out of each other. And then you take a lot of people, a lot of workers are working like a Friday and a Saturday, a Shimmer weekend. There's 5 shows. Potentially you could work 5 nights in one weekend, or five matches in one weekend. So it's a lot of the same training, especially because, like I said before, my lineage of catch wrestling isn't all that different, no matter whether I'm working or shooting. But again, the endurance training changes a bit, as well as not as much concentration on making a certain weight class.
In MMA, there's a women's revolution going on, and you're a member of the legendary Horsewomen, one of the other members being Ronda Rousey. And I think, while certainly MMA has gained some attention for women being involved, we have the retired Gina Carano, who was in MMA for quite some time before switching over to acting. But I really think it was with Ronda's involvement with the UFC, her being the first signed female talent to be involved with that organization, that it really got mainstream attention, women's involvement in the sport. So what does it mean to you to be a part of this revolution, and what power of influence do you have over the sport?
Well, I think, I've been fighting for like 16 years now. So I think I'm one of the last few left that are still competing, that were competing way back in the day when no one even knew what MMA was, let alone women's MMA. But I think that putting in the work when no one was able to see it has a lot to do with girls like Gina and like Ronda to see the sport and see that they could do it, and then carry it into bigger and bigger audiences. On top of that, you have to think, I'd like to think that Ronda and the popularity to women's MMA that she's brought, and it has made it visible, and I think she's made it kind of known to places like the WWE, are able to see now that people are willing to see girls that can kick the crap out of each other but still think of them as sexy. And so I think that part of the women's revolution that's happening in wrestling has to do with us that have been putting women's fighting to the forefront of people's visibility for so long.
Absolutely, absolutely. And certainly you said one of the key differences between conditioning in wrestling and conditioning in MMA is that in MMA you're always pressured to reach a certain benchmark as far as your weight goes. So how do you embrace the training in MMA when there's so much pressure to do so? I know that there have been friends of mine who aren't nearly as famous but who have struggled reaching a certain number. So how do you go about training in that aspect?
Well, it's just part of being a professional and having that drive. There's it's not to say that just because in wrestling I don't have to make a certain weight on the scale like I do in MMA. I still eat very healthy, and you eat for performance. So there's a way you can mess with your macros, and not to get too much into it, but everything's carbs, proteins, fats, and you need all of it. But it's just the right type of nutritional timing in order to be able to perform. And then on top of that, can I perform and also lose weight, or can I perform and maintain weight? Can I perform and push the limits of how I can work out because my energy levels are higher because I'm able to eat more, certain things like this. So it really helps to have to be on a team that has really experienced fighters and experienced coaches to kind of set the path, So I have my strength conditioning coach also writes out a specific diet plan for my goals, and I have to check in with him weekly as far as my weight and how I'm feeling and body fat percentage and stuff like this so that he can adjust immediately if something seems to not be going the way that we had planned on it. Now, as far as the drive, you know, a lot of people have trouble making a certain weight or something at the amateur level. When I was amateur, I fought my first, it had to have been like 10 fights that I was fighting at like 150. And I didn't actually start cutting weight until I started getting paid as a professional. And that was just, it wasn't as defined back then, 16 years ago. Like it's kind of a big deal today when fighters suddenly make, you know, turn pro or whatever. Back then it was like, okay, I'm not getting paid, and now I'm getting paid. But I always tell people that we get paid in mixed martial arts to make weight because the fighting is fun. And so that makes things easier. And it's really looked down on. And I think especially at a time when I was coming up, MMA and especially women's MMA was really fighting for legitimacy. And I think I carried that kind of burden into, you know, how's it going to look if they're already thinking it's a joke and then I just show up on the scale and don't make weight. So everyone kind of has to find their own personal reasons for doing it, but it really truly takes a lot of discipline. I can't wait till the day I'm like a fat, lazy trainer. So it's not like something I enjoy doing all the time, but it's just part of the job, you know?
Mm-hmm. So as far as both products of wrestling and MMA, the way that you were booked and whether the fans hook onto it. So as far as both products go, what do you look for in an opponent? Because I can imagine that when you're under contract for an organization in either field, I mean, there's only so much power that you have in terms of booking yourself. But I can imagine that you'd have the final yay or nay over that agreement. So what do you look for in an opponent in both fields?
Well, I think in MMA you have, it's not ultimately your performance. It doesn't matter what the other person ends up looking like. So like you can have a fight against someone who's horrible and beat them up, and maybe the fight's not exciting, but you beat them up, but really what did it do for you? You know, so you kind of have to balance this, someone that's going to be good for you if you win, which means they're going to be a little bit more dangerous, but it's calculated risks, right? So whereas in wrestling, I feel like I want girls that are going to be able to keep up with what I'm doing, and I'm sure they feel the same way. You want you know, ideally, and it's not always like this, but ideally you want someone who's easy to work with, who knows your style and what you do, and can keep up with you. That's kind of the big thing I'm discovering as far as pro wrestling is. I am starting to realize that the time I put into MMA makes me a vet in a wrestling locker room. Instead of coming in like, oh, guys, hi, I'm new to this and all this, especially like if I'm talking to you before about my martial lineage and everything being the same, I have to keep those sorts of things in mind. And so it really does depend on the individual and where they're at in their career and also what their goals are. And just not playing it safe, taking risks, but calculated risk. And with calculated risk also comes the risk of failing. But if you calculate the risk right, even in failure, there's a win to be had. So it's something like when an offer happens, and this is, for me at least, no matter if it's pro wrestling or mixed martial arts, an offer comes across the table. I sit down with my coaching staff, my management, and we like go have lunch or something, and we sit and talk it out and weigh the pros and cons and make a decision. And they'll give me their recommendation, but you know, ultimately it's up to me whether I want to venture into those things.
Absolutely, and you just touched upon failure and the way that you take calculated risks. they say that you never learn from success, that failure is the way that you truly learn how to improve yourself, whether that's getting an injury or having an opportunity pass up that you might have or should have pursued. So how have you learned and embraced failure? Because it can be tough when you're pressured to look a certain way or to meet a certain benchmark with the weight. Or, with Ronda in her first loss, she struggled with that. She's recovered, obviously, and she'll be fine with the superstar that she is and very athletic that she is. But how do you embrace failure? Because that can be very, very difficult.
I think the biggest thing this day and age is realizing that failure as you define it for yourself, or no, success as you define it for yourself, is going to be far different than success and how Twitter defines it. And I say that very broadly. I just mean social media in general. But it's interesting because, and this is just one example, but hopefully people will understand the bigger picture of what I'm talking about. But something like the UFC, there is life outside the UFC. And whether that means there's other fights outside the UFC or other opportunities, the UFC is not the be-all, end-all of someone's life. And I think Dominic Cruz, before his last fight, when he came back from a long layoff and won the title again, he was being interviewed, and they asked him, "Is this the best moment of your life?" And he said, "No, the best moment of my life was realizing that I didn't need this belt to be okay." And I think that when you come to that realization, you can find success in every failure. Now, of course, after failures, and it's like you talked about, whether it's in the weight, hitting weight benchmarks, whether it's something in training you've been working on and you just can't get it in practice, or a fight, or whatever it is. There, of course, is a time where you sit and you sulk about it. But you let that sit in. And then a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe longer, maybe shorter, you go back and you look at it without the emotion involved. And there's success to be found. If a child is learning to walk and they fall down 50 times, nobody would tell that child to stop walking. They don't have it in them. It's their path, and if they didn't fall down all 50 of those times, maybe they wouldn't be walking right now. And sometimes people like to think they know the path you're supposed to be on, but nobody has a right to tell you what your path should look like on the way to where your goals are. And as long as you can take something like falling down when you're learning to walk and realize that it's just you learning to walk, that's a success. It's only a failure if you let that defeat you. And it's such a broad and inspiring thing that you'll read on those motivational posters, but it really is true. When you can really embrace that, things change, and you really start turning corners with it.
I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up this next subject, but you are a member of the legendary Four Horsewomen, and Ronda Rousey is, of course, a member of that alongside you. You're a good friend of hers. You've been a good friend of hers for a long time. And, of course, as we've discussed, she's definitely opened up a lot of doors within the sport of MMA. But as far as your relationship, and to be completely honest, I'm not as involved with mixed martial arts as I am in wrestling. So could you give me kind of a rundown of your relationship with her, what you've gained through working with her, whether that's training or just interacting with her as a person, because she's definitely going to go really far and continue to excel no matter how many wins or losses she racks up.
Yeah, I mean, she's one of my closest friends, and we all used to live in a house together in Venice. And we said that Ronda bought a house and wanted to stay in Venice. And if anyone knows anything about housing in California, Venice is super expensive. And so the place she had to buy, because she wanted to stay in Venice, is too small for all four of us to live there. So now we all kind of live separately, but we're around each other all the time. We watch wrestling together. We travel together. We eat together. We hang out together. You know, we're still very good friends. And we all train together. Ronda brings all of us in for her camp. She has very closed off camps, but she brings us in for different reasons. I'm one of her main grappling partners. You know, Marina and her have grown up doing judo together, and Jess is super long striker, so it's good work for her, you know, getting inside, things like this. And then, like, Marina and myself and Jess, we all train under Josh Barnett on a daily basis, so we're all very involved in each other's lives. And that's one of the things, you know, it's funny because MMA fans are so hell-bent on, like, this Four Horsewomen moniker that's followed us around as though it means that we're claiming to be the most dominant, best women fighters that ever lived on Earth, when really it's just a name that a fan gave us because we live and train together. And there's really not another team of women that have that going on. And it's really about our friendships more than our fighting. And there's a lot of people that will, you know, Ronda needs to get rid of, after any of us loses, Ronda needs to get rid of them. Those losers, like, as though, you know, like, what kind of friend are you that if your friend stumbled, you would ditch them? It's ridiculous. They hold us to this higher standard sometimes, but we really are truly, like, no, not a work or anything. We are very close friends, the four of us. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, fans being fans, of course, they thrust the business and they allow us to do what we need to do, but they also judge without a lot of context, so that's given with the territory, unfortunately. But before we wrap up, when your career has run its course, and whether due to injury or whatever else, you retire or decide to pursue another field of entertainment or whatever the case is, what is it that you want to be remembered for by the fans the most? When I think of you, what do you want me to think about?
I want to be known for I was willing to fight. I've always been willing to fight, and I've always been innovative, and I've always been entertaining. And the real bottom line is I've always been a wrestler. In MMA, I've always proclaimed pro wrestling as what I do, and you know, I want to be remembered for paving the way when no one was paying attention. It seems like now, especially with the popularity of the UFC, it seems like everyone's memory is as long as their Twitter timeline, and it's easy to get forgotten. And I think that is the first time that my heart was broken about MMA, that I put in all these years and all this time and busted my tail, only to the first time I stumble, have everyone talk about how I've never been that good and I've never done anything and what have I done and I didn't deserve this. It's like, man, I put all this time in when it's not going to matter in the end. And so I just want people to remember enough that it matters. You know, all the time I put in. I get teary-eyed almost when I see wrestlers, even if they're bad guys, their whole career, and the crowd has booed them their entire career, to hear the crowd chant "Thank you, whoever," right, on their last match or on their way out. And it seems like in wrestling, at the very end of the day, the workers get appreciated for putting their body on the line and entertaining the fans. And I think all I really ever want out of MMA is an appreciation for the fact that I've done that for them in that on the working side of pro wrestling.
So before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance to plug in how people can contact you, whether that's for bookings in wrestling or product endorsements or anything, just to say hey, because there are a lot of figures out there in social media. So how can we reach you if we want to contact you?
Yeah, I'm QOS Baszler on everything, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and on my Twitter profile is my booking email, QOSBaszler@gmail, but if you forget that, you just follow me on Twitter, check out my Twitter profile, and hit me up on email there.
Thank you so much, Shayna, for your time. I've greatly enjoyed talking to you, and you're a legend in my book, and you always will be. So I really appreciate your time, and this was a huge honor for me. So best of luck to you, and thank you again.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for giving me the mouthpiece.
Thanks to everyone else for